Testing 1, 2, 3. Hi everyone, and welcome to another Woke Wednesday. This podcast was created to shed light on different societal issues which have been at the forefront of public discourse through one of the most divisive times in American history. More so, it was created with the intent of allowing those who have often been neglected, shunned, misunderstood, to have a chance to share their experiences and thoughts. I hope that this dialogue encourages critical conversation and activism amongst all listeners, and I hope you'll tell all your friends about it and share it on your social platforms. Rapper and community activist Nipsey Hussle was recently gunned down in front of his clothing store Marathon located in South LA. South LA has been Nipsey's home for his entire life and where he did a lot of his civic work. As a community activist, Nipsey was committed to building his community of Hyde Park back up by continuously giving back. He owned multiple businesses in the neighborhood in which he purposefully offered jobs to those he knew were struggling, helped fund campus playgrounds to be built at local elementary schools, and so much more. A year ago, he helped create Vector 90, a creative combination co-workspace and STEM center for underprivileged people that helps them connect to corporate opportunities in wealthier areas like Silicon Valley, and works to call attention to the lack of diversity in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics field. For Nipsey, encouraging kids of color to be engaged in technology and science stemmed from his love for music added with his childhood. Growing up, he knew that to be in music and to get his brand out there, he'd have to utilize technology, and he couldn't afford engineers that would aid his production. So, he taught himself how to use the different mixing systems he needed to produce his music. Today, we've truly seen his hard work pay off, being that his debut album, Victory Lap, was a top 10 record and Grammy nominated. While his death doesn't go unnoticed, because literally thousands of not only celebrities but fans from across the world have paid their respects by either visiting his storefronts, having candlelit vigils worldwide, or by posting heartfelt messages detailing how the rapper not only impacted them with his music, but his activism as well. With all of the support flowing in, it doesn't go without saying that while Nipsey Hussle did make positive impacts on his community, he did receive a lot of backlash, and rightfully so, during his life because of a homophobic post he made on Instagram. Nipsey posted a photo of several young black boys in tuxedos at a formal event with the caption, "Demonstration speaks louder than conversation. They're going to feed us every image of our men and boys, but not this one. No hyper-violent, no homosexual, no abandoners. Just strong black men and young men." Toxic black masculinity has long been an issue amongst the black community and rap culture in general. Nipsey's comment not only invokes a bigoted nature, but they also suggest that violence, queerness, and abandoners are all on the same level. As to suggest that being gay means you're inherently violent, and if men that abandon their families because of their queerness, although this does happen for some because they have to because their families don't accept them. Moreover, Nipsey didn't know any of these young men personally in the photograph, so for him to assume their heterosexuality is a clear reflection of how heteronormative our society has been and continues to be. Homophobia runs rampant in every community. There's no mistaking that. Yet, it's so deeply ingrained in the black community, and even more specifically, the black male community, that is constantly passed down from generation to generation. Whether it's the deep religious hold that causes black people to be homophobic, or whatever the reason, it's long been a problem amongst black people. Toxic Black masculinity is clearly what led him to post this photo. And until the Black community begins seriously addressing this issue, we'll continue to have these problems. While I am deeply saddened that Nipsey was taken away from his family at such a young age, I do truly appreciate all of his efforts to further build Black wealth and promote Black prosperity. However, I would be showing my privilege as a cisgender heterosexual woman if I didn't address his comments that have impacted the LGBTQ community in a negative way. Now, let's get into this week's episode. In the midst of all the chaos surrounding UGA's racist Snapchat video circulating the internet, which, by the way, to my knowledge, they still have not expelled these boys, but that's a conversation for another day, we decided it best to feature an episode covering the intricacies of systemic racism. Obviously, we've touched on this idea multiple times in past episodes with specific examples of systemic racism through the criminal justice system, education, and more. But I wanted to dive into the overarching structure of systemic racism and what it actually means. To understand racism as a structure, you first have to differentiate the definitions of racism, prejudice, and discrimination. People often use these terms synonymously, however, they all have different meanings. Prejudice is prejudgment about another person based on the different social groups to which that person belongs. It consists of thoughts and feelings that include stereotypes, generalizations, and attitudes that are typically projected onto everyone from that group. Make no mistake when I say, all humans have prejudice. We can't avoid it, and those that claim not to have it aren't as self-aware as they should be. Discrimination, however, is action based on these prejudices that we hold. Actions like ignoring, excluding, violence, threats, slander, etc. all include forms of discrimination. Again, all humans have the ability to discriminate as well, no matter what social group they belong to. Yet, when it comes to racism, that's more complex, more nuanced. Racism is a system. When a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, it's transformed into racism. It's expressed in the practice of social and political institutions, and it's reflected in disparities regarding wealth, income, criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education, among other things. So, based on that definition, it's important to acknowledge that technically, if we're speaking in regards to the U.S., only the dominant group, being white people, can be racist. Because white people control multiple institutions that have the power to create laws and policies solely to benefit them and negatively affect other groups, that is why white people, in this case, being that we're in the U.S., can only be considered racist when we're talking about these different systems. Moreover, this idea of reverse racism is thus dismantled because if only the dominant groups legitimately have power, then those who aren't in as much control, such as Black people, Latinos or Hispanics, Native American, multiracial, and so on, could not flip the switch and be racist against the dominant group. And just to be clear, prejudice exists regardless of race or ethnicity. And the systemic racism we particularly face in the United States stems from a white patriarchal dominance. Demeaning acts can occur anywhere from anyone, period. But when it comes to the power systems of the U.S. specifically, we refer to white dominance oppressing minority communities. If you want to further explore that subject, I would highly suggest you read the book White Fragility or just go listen to the past episode on white fragility. It's really good. Now, I realize that a lot of listeners probably know this distinction between these words, but for those that don't, it should be acknowledged because we are all continuously learning about the people around us and how they're treated on a systematic basis. The U.S. has a long history of being a main player in contributing and creating institutional policies that deeply impact people. From slavery to Jim Crow to Plessy v. Ferguson to Flint, Michigan, the criminal justice system to the forced relocation of Native Americans and confinement to reservation land, as well as Japanese internment camps and other structural systems barring Asian communities the same benefits. And more recently, the issue of immigration from Latin American communities and Mexico, with restrictive policy in place to deliberately discriminate against Hispanic and Latinx people. The U.S. has and continues to be a country built on structural oppression. A very clear example in how systemic racism occurs today is through economic mobility. People of color have consistently had limited access to home loans, safer neighborhoods, and higher paying jobs that would propel them not just to higher statuses, but just to a livable, safe one. Voting rights is another clear example of structural discrimination. The first group in this country to have voting rights was white men. For years, only white men had the innate privilege of voting for and being elected into political positions that would control how the country was run. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was adopted, which gave African American men the right to vote as well. Yet, if you go look at a history book, it's so clear in how, although the right was given to black men, still, many of them didn't get to vote because of discriminatory practices like literacy tests, the grandfather clause, which honestly, all of them were horrible and discriminatory, but that shit is fucking crazy to me that they literally made a law that wouldn't allow black men to vote if their grandfather couldn't vote. But how would that be the case if their grandfathers were slaves and had no rights? That shit makes no sense. Anyways, and poll taxes were enforced to prevent African American men from voting. These practices were especially prevalent in southern states and continued until the 1960s with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which broke all of those legal barriers. Even though a lot of them are still in place, we are just seeing it in a different way. Although the Voting Rights Act did make all of those practices illegal and give all African Americans the right to vote, we still see structural oppression at play with voting, but like I said, in different ways like gerrymandering, redlining, not allowing felons to vote, which is, I have thoughts about that. The intricacies of voter registration and the lack of flexibility with when people can go to the polls is still a huge problem that prevents low-income communities made of minorities from participating in elections. Literally, that one takes the cake for me. The fact that people will literally have to wait in line for hours to vote, although many of them, not all of them, because I clearly don't know everyone, many of them are on hourly wage, low income hourly wage, and they're taking time out of their day to go vote, but they have to be in there for fucking hours. This just, like I said, I have a lot of thoughts and opinions about that and how voting today is so fucking hard to do for a lot of people.
There's an old song that says that we who believe in freedom cannot rest. And this year certainly put that to the test. On behalf of Fair Fight Action, I want to say thank you to the organizers, the allies, and the supporters that made this year a year to test our resolve, but also to find success. Let's start with the good news. Because of the work done by Fair Fight Action allies and organizers, we were able to block legislation that would have ended cash bail reform. Legislation passed to support dyslexia. Work was done to introduce for the first time in Georgia history a bill that would allow all Georgia residents to have driver's licenses. These are important steps forward, and I'm grateful for the work done. We were also able to block legislation that would have restored vouchers in the state of Georgia, something that can never be allowed to happen for our school children to be successful. But there's some bad news too. Despite his promises, we know that the current administration is not focused on economic issues. They're focused on putting money in their own pockets and taking rights away from women. That's why I'm deeply disappointed by the success of HB 316, a bill that will provide corruption in our electoral system instead of reform. And I'm deeply disheartened by the passage of HB 481, a bill so divisive and so wrong that Republicans walked out rather than cast a vote in favor. But we know that this work will not end simply because the session ends. We know that we have to fight every day to fix our electoral system, to push forward on important pieces of legislation like hate crimes bills. We have work to do, but I know from this year that we can do it, that we can fight hard and win. And I thank you for all the work you've done to not only make this a fair fight, but to make sure that action is a part of what we do. On behalf of Fair Fight Action and everyone, thank you.
However, on a positive note, one groundbreaking commitment to breaking down structural barriers comes from Stacey Abrams' company, Fair Fight Action, which positively addresses one of the most deep-rooted racial issues in the American South, which is voting. After the mismanagement and irregularities in the Georgia governor race, in which literally Brian Kemp suppressed minority votes, Abrams created this initiative in order to promote voting rights to be equitable for all voters in the state of Georgia, which props to her, because as I personally know, and a lot of you all know, minority communities are deliberately discriminated against when it comes to redrawing district lines and having access to polling places. Like I said, it's crazy that things like this continue to happen in 2019. However, it's a good thing that we do have people like Stacey Abrams who are committed to closing these gaps and making these rights accessible to all and not just some. Another present day phenomena that we're seeing in terms of systemic racism deals with immigration. The current Trump administration is making the process of immigration even harder than it already was in the first place when he rescinded DACA. Yes, I know it was overturned. He literally wants to build a border wall to prevent the number of immigrants from coming in. And he literally, a few days ago, referred to those seeking asylum as animals and not people.
Okay, Margaret.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, sheriffs in California are now in an untenable position when it comes to trying to figure out now. We have state law, we have federal laws, and here we are stuck in the middle. Sheriffs especially, because most of us run our county jails. When there became a legal challenge to the 48-hour holds for ICE, it was very frustrating for us. So what I did is I invited ICE to put their officers in my jail so they're able to do their work. We didn't have the staffing to be able to help figure out who they wanted to talk to, who they didn't. I said, come on in, work with our people to keep our community safe. 2 weeks later, Mr. President, Kate Steinle was murdered. Yeah. Now, I wasn't the only sheriff to do that. Sheriff Youngblood did, Sheriff Christensen, and it was perfect because we didn't have to take our time with our staff to do anything. ICE was in there doing their work in a safe, controlled environment, and then the initiatives started happening, the Trust Act, the Truth Act, and finally SB 54, the Values Act. And that is causing us all kinds of turmoil. So here we are, stuck in the middle, trying to decide. We have federal law, we have state law, and that's why I welcomed Attorney General Sessions' lawsuit, because that will provide us clarity that we need and direction that we need. What do we do? Because here we are. And I appreciated Mr. Holman and the ICE. We had a great relationship. We still do. But now ICE is the only law enforcement agency that cannot use our databases to find the bad guys. They cannot come in and talk to people in our jail unless they reach a certain threshold. They can't do all kinds of things that other law enforcement agencies can do. And it's really put us in a very bad position. It's a disgrace.
And we're suing on that, and we're working hard, and I think it'll all come together because people want it to come together. It's so ridiculous. The concept that we're even talking about it is so ridiculous. We'll take care of it, Margaret.
Thank you. There could be an MS-13 gang member I know about. If they don't reach a certain threshold, I cannot tell ICE about them.
We have people coming into the country, or trying to come in. We're stopping a lot of them. But we're taking people out of the country. You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. These aren't people. These are animals. And we're taking them out of the country at a level and at a rate that's never happened before. And because of the weak laws, they come in fast. We get them, we release them, we get them again, we bring them out. It's crazy. The dumbest laws, as I said before, the dumbest laws on immigration in the world. So we're going to take care of it, Margaret. We'll get it done.
And that's just scratching the surface with some of the racist shit he said. Like, it's a continual thing from this man, and it's still not effectively addressed. Well, it should have been addressed in 2016 when his ass shouldn't have been voted into the office. But anyways, holistically, Trump's administration is a prime example of institutional racism prevailing because these individual people all hold specific power to create and continue the already repressive systems we have in place. Another thing to think about is this perpetual state of mind still continues among white elites. Aside from slavery, which obviously we all know was despicable and has become ingrained in American cultural consciousness, people tend to forget and overlook barriers of access to Asian communities. Japanese internment was one of the most despicable acts of racism our country has seen. Confining Japanese Americans during World War II in response to white anxiety over another Japanese American attack on American soil following Pearl Harbor. This form of racism, stemming from immigration, is usually voiced through politics of fear. White elites have historically and continue to use fear tactics and rhetoric to avow immigrants of different races as dangerous. Most recently, immigrants from Mexico and Latin America are continuously demonized. Like I said, from our fucking president to be very specific, and from other people. A specific example being the migrant caravan that Republicans were so scared of due to inflamed rhetoric and fear tactics. And you want to know why? Well, let's look to the sources to help explain white fear. Dr. M.V. Hood at UGA has researched partisan shifts in the region and has written multiple books on the political divergence between the races in the American South. He theorizes that conservatives in the South tend to skew white and liberals to incorporate more minority groups due to systemic practices put in place to bar oppositional parties from achieving positions of power. The racial threat had essentially become a political one, with minority groups presenting a political threat to white elites, literally a threat to their power, and that can help explain fear tactics against other minority groups throughout our country's history. With minorities leaning left, they give more political clout to left-leaning politicians, granting them more power, which means they're taking away power from white elites who have long dominated systemic institutions in the U.S. Honestly, we could continue on down this rabbit hole with the human need and quest for power. But hopefully, this helps put into perspective why leaders, in this case, white elites, have gone to such great lengths to stifle minority and immigrant voices and bar their way to opportunity, suppressing their power and preservation of a white system of dominance. I hope that this episode was informative and thought-provoking for all that listened and for those that will listen in the future. I hope that the systemic implications of continuous white dominance allows each of us to become more critically involved with our government institutions as a whole in order to actively pursue change for underserved communities. To recognize the injustice that's innately embedded in our system is one thing, but we have to do more than just acknowledge it. We have to seek to change it. Remember, all of these opinions are my own, but they should be everyone else's. Have a woke Wednesday. Thank you for another Woke Wednesday. Transcripts of entire episodes will be available on the Woke Wednesday website. Episodes are written and produced by Hannah Mason and Trey Leonard of Linico Entertainment. Episodes are hosted by Hannah Mason and edited by Trey Leonard. All graphics are designed by Anna French.